Welcome to this podcast. We're going to be exploring design thinking in your course development, how to put students at the center of their experiences. And I have with me Christina Scavuzzo. So, Christina, welcome and thanks for giving some time over to talk about the challenges facing faculty when they're transferring from traditional to high flex learning. Your expertise, tell me a little bit about your background in design thinking.
Absolutely. So I've been a UX researcher, design researcher for about 5 years now, and I started in a more ethnographic kind of role doing research for an architecture firm, post-occupational research, but have gradually moved over into the product research space. But that's covered a number of different industries, from working at Tesla, from working at Coursera, working in retail, and various other forms of medicine and health tech. And so I've had the opportunity to take this particular skill set and just see how it can actually contribute so much to so many different industries and problem space applications.
Talk me through some of the design concepts you feel would be really helpful for us.
Absolutely. Kind of assume that sort of what you did know has the world has sort of upended and that context has really shifted. There's a lot of great information, obviously, around learning online and digital pedagogy, et cetera. You mentioned high flex learning. But my initial recommendations around this would be to think about, from a semester perspective, doing some journey mapping. What do you want students to learn? Why do you want them to learn it? How are they going to show you that they've learned it? Nothing too revolutionary there, but really being able to articulate that as a professor, and even just make the assumption that you may have assumed that you know what people are supposed to be learning at each stage, but that the exercise of articulating that from the student's perspective, it can be really powerful. And then to kind of drill into that would be thinking about use cases. And so traditionally, from a product perspective, a use case is something that a designer, a UX researcher, a product manager, an engineer would walk themselves through. And it's really meant to be the manifestation of deep qualitative and quantitative work to be able to articulate user goal, who is the user, why are they here, and then how are they going to accomplish that goal, and what does it look like when they have accomplished that goal. And so being able to do that is really, that kind of like articulates the beginning of the workflow that you're going to be designing, and it also ends up being the more or less the template that you're going to use when you want to validate that idea.
Question then about the use cases and the empathy side of things is, how does a faculty who probably hasn't been a student for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, how do they put themselves in the shoes of the learner? I mean, would we use focus groups? Do we just have to think laterally, or should we be encouraging faculty to actually take an online course themselves?
But I think what would actually be really helpful here is if professors, and we talked a little bit about this before, put themselves in the shoes of the student, took an online class, and tried to learn something that was outside of their discipline. So, doing something that didn't necessarily build on existing skills, but allowed them to take on the beginner mindset. I think would be really powerful, because then you discover firsthand the frustration of not being able to raise your hand when you're come up against a challenging concept. You have to pause the video experience and then go and do some external research. But just develop empathy from that perspective. I think that's really accessible. But then also, I think now might actually be the time to turn to students and how seek their input and treat them as collaborators as much as possible. So anything from creating surveys, which I think might, is like fairly low touch, but might be more manageable for professors who feel like, their timelines are kind of getting expanded and want to retain some kind of control over that. But I think doing not necessarily a focus group, but maybe speaking to some students who are doing really well with online learning, and then some students who are really struggling. So something that I really like doing in my research is focusing on edge case engagement. And because I think that can be a really powerful way to see who has hacked the system and or really benefited from the system, what has really worked for them, maybe that works for other people. Conversely, who is really struggling and what can we learn from them, and try and solve for those problems as well.
So edge case, tell me what that means.
Sure. So you're really looking at kind of extreme examples of behavior. And it's not to say that outliers always have the most to say about a given population of users or students, but along a certain variable or axis, in this case, engagement or performance, then you can use extreme examples of that. Again, not outliers in the data set, but people who are exhibiting extreme behavior along a type of behavior. And I did this a lot at Coursera, where it was looking at people who were just flying through courses, completing lots of different content. Okay, so that's like a hyper engaged user in that case. They're wildly successful. Let's understand why. And then people who would sign up for a course, who would even go so far as to pay for being able to have tests and quizzes, etc., but would drop off after a week and a half, or would drop off right before their first quiz, etc. So trying to just understand how there was all this like initial engagement, and then, you know, what were the obstacles that sent them kind of flying, and using that system of a single variable or a kind of behavior, and then finding the extreme examples of that behavior, how that's being manifested, and then interrogating that can be really helpful.
So
But
that's
I think
certainly,
focus groups are kind of problematic because people end up biasing each other. And I'm sure you find that in the classroom as well, where it's like you can have a really amazing group discussion, but people's ideas are influencing each other, which is part of the goal of discussion. But I think from a focus group perspective, if you're really trying to get feedback, it's great to try and have one-on-one interviews where possible.
yeah, I mean, it certainly resonates even looking back at the spring semester, that they hung in there and they got through the course and did a sterling job. But what you're saying with edge cases is, you know, don't design only for, you know, the 60% majority. Make sure you're covering the other 40%, which could be a diverse range of. Let's focus with education, since you mentioned Coursera there. Not necessarily a Coursera case, but if I'm thinking about my course design for the fall, how can I make sure it's watertight on the first day of semester so that I don't have to change anything for the whole of the semester?
So I think what's interesting about that, and I was considering this because we've talked a little bit about that before, is I think by modularizing how you're approaching your semester, so it's by concept, where I think professors often get a lot of feedback. And again, if you modularize your content and you realize that like one piece might actually require more explanation, or like there's a lot of engagement from students, there's a lot of interest, maybe you're actually able to downgrade other modules. And so then there is a way to not totally scrap the plan that you've created, but because you have gone through the exercise yourself of seeing your year or your semester in these kinds of chunks, that there's a way that's already built in for you to be flexible and to be responsive to engagement. And so I think that as I'm kind of thinking out loud here, that could actually be a really important part of learning online, which is certainly you have material that you have to get through, but you also want to be responsive when your distanced students are really engaging with material. If you can give them another couple of days to engage in something that's really inspiring them to be excited about the content, I think that kind of flexibility would be tremendous, particularly if you're getting engagement in online forums, you're getting students, cropping up in Zoom meetings with each other, et cetera. I think that's an opportunity for professors to foster the potential for online learning from a community-based perspective.
So I said it out at the start of that question, I want everything on day one to be designed so that the whole semester's or ready to go. But the reality is you've got to have some step out points at any stage, because you've got an audience. This is about learning and teaching. I can talk, but if I'm not making any sense, it's going to be very difficult for the students. So that flexibility also gives us a comfort zone, I think, because it's very much like the traditional classroom where we react to the audience. We react to the audience, I guess, is one way of doing that. But talk to me a little bit about, areas where co-creation may work and areas where co-creation with the user isn't a good idea.
Absolutely. So I think you can really do a good job of capturing not the hypothetical, but what has worked in the past. And so what really works well, both from writing surveys to also crafting interview questions. So thinking about the high-touch qualitative user interview where it's you and one other participant, potentially some other people listening in, but you're really just having this conversation. It's a series of reflective activities. And so you're asking them to think about, walk me through the last test you took. How did you prepare for that? I spent 2 hours on Wikipedia and reviewed my notes, but didn't touch your lectures. Like, so, so like that's the kind of feedback that you can get there. And so I think from that perspective, what you're doing is you're capturing behavior, you're capturing attitudes. You're not asking them to speculate. You're just asking them to recall how they problem solved in an experience, in a context, either that is parallel or an exact, or something that you recently created for them. And that act of reflection, what they're able to recall is top of mind, was most salient, made a huge impression, or made an impression. And that act of recall of these specific experiences can be incredibly poignant in terms of what are we taking out of this in terms of friction in the system, learning styles, how students are being resourceful, and maybe a little bit of the pressure can be taken off the professor. And part of the task is to, and I think we talked maybe about this a little while ago, but the idea that doing some messaging around how to be resourceful as an online learner and how to seek out other resources, and that it's actually kind of unreasonable to expect a professor to provide all of the information, but maybe there's an opportunity to bring guidance around credible resources, ways to get unstuck, other learning platforms where students can augment a topic that they're particularly interested in, but the professor doesn't have time to go into depth with. So from a co-collaborative perspective, really helpful to think through issues, really helpful to think through, again, kind of returning to this edge case user perspective. You can identify the friction points, walk me through how you prepare for this test, walk me through how you take notes, walk me through how you sit through a video lecture. Are you pausing it frequently? Are you Googling things as you go? Are you just kind of super confused and tuned out? So it's really just take me through a day in the life of being you and all of the challenges that are attendant in experiencing a video lecture, and then planning for quizzes and assignments, etc. Then talking to someone who is again flying through your course, acing everything, and maybe use that opportunity to learn from them, and like what are resources that students who are performing really well in this environment using to do that well. Are they meditating? Are they just knuckling down and able to just really take amazing notes, etc.? But how are they doing that? Are they pausing the video? Are they creating transcripts, etc.? But using that, so not so much as I think initially when you're doing this kind of early information gathering, you're not saying let's create together, but this is more of an empathy exercise. And so I think once you've done this initial kind of friction points and how people are navigating the system and making it work for them, once you've gathered those behaviors and attitudes and pain points and needs, then you can come back and say, hey, this is what we feel like we learned from you all. How do we make something that works for you? So that would be phase 2. Which we can certainly talk about now or at another point. But.
Yeah, I mean the benefit of many learning management systems and online platforms is that you can actually draw data down, which shows you the extent to which students are engaged. User reports effectively. It's a great diagnostic to see how well the patient's faring is one way of thinking of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say what's really interesting about using those kinds of analytics, and we would do that a lot at various companies that I've worked at, where you see someone's meant to engage with X, Y, and Z components of this page or this element of the platform, and they get totally lost, or they do this thing called rage clicking, where they're just clicking over and over again because it's so frustrating, the experience at that point. And so what you get from that is that there is an issue. But you don't know what the issue is. So I think that's really kind of the beauty of the qualitative and the quantitative is quant helps you do the initial diagnostic, but then understanding the experience of why that was frustrating or why that was an obstacle or why that was confusing, then that really gets fleshed out through the qualitative research process. So yeah, absolutely. I think maybe that certainly helps professors scale. Maybe this, it's like 2 students who are the only ones who are struggling. Maybe you then have the opportunity to really focus on their needs, and you don't need to redesign the course because those issues have been isolated to a couple of students. But if everyone is having issues, if everyone did poorly on the quiz, did poorly on the test, then those are indicators where maybe something needs to change more fundamentally. But yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. I'm just sort of thinking about the various experiences I've had using statistics and then talking to the students. What does that do to me in terms of changing the design? One of the things that I learned very quickly when I started teaching in University of San Diego was that students weren't used to taking notes.
Hmm.
The more I talked to the students, the more I realized that their expectation was that the professor would provide a workbook,
Hmm.
which was very common. So I toyed with the idea of producing a workbook, and instead I required the students to take notes and put them in a journal and submit that journal for assessment. And that is qualitative in some respects, but it is quantitative data, because you suddenly find that what the students take away from the lecture and what you thought you were delivering can be completely different areas, completely different
Yeah.
experiences. So you think, this is a really profound framework. Let me tell you about this framework. But you don't tell the students it's a profound framework. You just think its beauty is gonna show. So
Hmm.
you have to kind of signpost
Yeah.
things a lot more in a classroom. In an online environment, maybe you do the same there.
Hmm. Interesting. Well, yeah, checking in on comprehension. And I think what's interesting is that's also, I mean, you realize that we're all pretty unreliable witnesses in a lot of
Mm,
cases. And so I actually think that that's the benefit of online learning in a lot of ways, where it's the opportunity to check your own understanding, where you can actually go back and revisit lectures or revisit pieces of content or readings, etc. And you're,
mm,
oh, like that's not quite how I remembered it, which explains why I got that wrong in the quiz. And so there
yeah.
is this sense of the content is captured, and you don't have to borrow like the top performing students' notes and like
Mm,
check all this different stuff. So there is I think there are a lot of silver linings to online learning.
yeah.
Uh, so yeah,
I agree.
that
And
definitely.
I do talk about different forms of assessment and why we're assessing, because it's at the heart of it. But that unreliable witness issue is such a profound one. The bias is really lean out.
Unreliable, but also like what they found interesting. So I think that's
Mm,
it's both, it's what they keyed into, but it's also not a complete picture because it's, yeah, so absolutely it's like that individual's,
yeah.
yeah.
And we rely on student evaluations a lot. And really what you're saying is student evaluations are absolutely critical, or user evaluations are absolutely critical, but don't wait until the end. Don't use a survey, and, don't base everything on the unreliable witness that comes through in the survey. So this, one of the messages I'm taking away very strongly here is, you have to know your students. You have to know the learners. You have to get to know them extremely well, and make it personal as well. By making it personal, I mean not just communicate frequently with them about course issues and send some really detailed directions for assignments, but let them know that you've got a dog that's a bit crazy, or a
Mhm.
dog that looks at you lovingly every time there's food around, or that your kids or grandkids are the light of your life, because that that relationship, I think, is an important aspect of design. One of the fascinating parts of design thinking is experience design, because it's produced and consumed at the same time. You can very rarely store it. How do you think about experience design in the context of the next semester for high flex or whatever form of teaching and learning that's going to be prevalent in universities?
Yeah, well, I think what's really interesting is I wonder if there are a lot of assumptions and sort of self-imposed rules that professors are coming up against. So this idea of planning, that it must be kind of set in stone. And then I do wonder if, in fact, by creating smaller and more bite-sized pieces of content, you're doing a couple of things that have both logistical applications, but then also iterative experience design applications,
Mm,
where um, you're not coming to the realization that you have to reshoot or re-record an hour and a half long lecture, but a 20-minute lecture, and you're realizing that you can reformat that. And so you're also, by collapsing that kind of workflow, what you're also doing is you're allowing yourself to be more responsive to the interests of your students, to the needs of your students, to them struggling with a certain section of content, etc. But I think from a longer planning perspective, if you can make it easier for you to change what you're
mm,
delivering,
mm,
however that ends up being possible, that definitely serves, I think, the workflow and the effort that professors have to put into things. And I think that
mm,
also makes it more conducive to for students to be able, as we talked about, to index that information and to reference things very specifically, but it also, yeah, it condenses the attention span that students need to have in order to engage in that content. It also makes it very specific and referenceable. But I think, again, kind of what you were talking about with this emphasis on deep empathy and, you know, just how these relationships and experiences are created and consumed at the same time. Again, kind of, it seems to be that you keep coming back to this idea of like, how do I plan out my whole semester? But I really think it's not this idea, that kind of pressure is self-imposed. And it feels like that's an arbitrary framework that can be interrogated, perhaps, in this time. And I think we were chatting a little bit before we started recording about this idea of there are the necessary elements of a semester that you have to deliver in terms of material, and then there are often a section of nice to haves. And so I think really leaning into that as like professors asking themselves, like, what are the assumptions I'm making about the rigidity of the way that I teach? And maybe I can actually find more creativity by asking myself, why do I assume that all of this has to be set in stone? This can be a draft that I edit with students as the semester goes along. And not to say that you throw out a third or, you know, 2/3 of your content. That's not what I'm suggesting. Or that, you know, students have fully self-directed learning someday, but not right now. But I think that there is a way to sort of ask yourself, what is the source of this pressure? What are the source of these constraints? Constraints are very real, but let's make sure that it's the real ones that we're trying to respond to. And let's also set up professors and students for success by making things easier to change and to discover and to engage with. So I think ease can, you know, ease and empathy can really be the guiding principles here. So I'll take it from 3 to 2. I'll give you 3: iterative, ease, and empathy.
Perfect. Well done. You met the challenge. What I like most about that is that it really underlines how personalized education works. Personalized education is not just, you know, good staff student ratios. You know, at USD we have small classes, and it's undoubtedly very personable and personal. But even at a distance, you can adapt the student's experience. You can give students latitude to explore a specific topic in a number of different and diverse ways, depending on their thoughts, their passions, their interests, their behaviors, their abilities. You can push students down particular routes that you'd never thought of. So yeah, I love that. Those 3, they're keepers. They really are. Christina, I want to thank you very much for your time and some really good insights, and I'm sure we'll do more of this, but yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. It was a pleasure to think about these things and to step back into the world of education